Ready to begin?
Yep.
We're trying to figure out what this puzzle is that's up on our desks. Are we supposed to put these in some
There's a puzzle?
order?
Didn't notice?
I'm a good puzzle solver.
Just leave them in the position where they're at.
Watching too much of Survivor.
All right, we'd like to call this meeting to order.
Tell me you don't do that.
Yeah, I do.
Please.
It teaches me political tricks.
Oh, no. It rots your
I think we'll invite Mr. Shanahan to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please.
All right.
All right.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Let the minutes show that all board members are present tonight. Do we have any desire to make changes on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. It's an opportunity for the public to comment on any items that are not on the agenda today. Do we have anyone wishing to make a comment? Seeing none, we have a consent agenda in front of us. Anyone desire to remove anything from the consent agenda? Seeing none,
Move consent calendar?
Second?
all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Eric, I guess we're on for your update on the project.
Good afternoon. We have a pretty full agenda with a lot of information, I'm sure, a lot of discussion. I'm going to try to keep this pretty short, as short as I can in terms of giving the highlights of the last quarter. And this is going well. During the last quarter, we made significant progress on implementing the project. The first thing, and put it in bold, today we actually received, it should be in front of you, the actual notice of permit for diversion and use of water. So it's becoming more and more official. When I say more and more, there's still things that we have to do to solidify actual utilizing that water. But this is pretty official right now. So we become a little bit more of a legitimate water agency. Okay. That was really, I consider that the highlight. It has to be the highlight, really, of the whole year, let alone that quarter. We also make significant progress relative to implementing our agreement with Tri-Cities CPG Regulation District 2035. We made progress, which its focus is going to be on design, build, operate. We issued the request for qualifications, and we received the statement of qualifications. You'll hear more about that in a few minutes. We also reached an agreement and initiated the design activities with RD 2035 utilizing MWH to provide the 30% design. We continued and really highlighted or initiated a little bit fuller in force, if you will, our efforts to accomplish some funding from outside sources. And I'm pleased to announce that working with RD 2035, we did receive funding for 100% funding for 30% design with the joint facility. So we helped RD 2035 accomplish that this last month. And we prepared the budget. You're going to hear about that as well later in our agenda. Those are some of the key actions of this last quarter. That means we're basically on schedule. We've met our milestones. At this point in time, we still see ourselves achieving our end bottom line of January 2016. I highlighted in red the two items that we really have to pay particular attention to. One is the permitting, in terms of keeping on track, as well as the funding. Those are two key elements. I feel confident of the other issues. Those other issues were those items we highlighted back in July as being critical. We're well underway to either having accomplished them or well on our way to finalizing resolution of each of those other items. The critical path really relates to achieving funding. The first item on that list is having a cooperative funding agreement between Reclamation and the California Department of Fish and Game. And this is associated with funding for the intake facility. We're really dependent on making that intake facility meet its own schedule with RD 2035, and this is a critical step in terms of that cooperative agreement. That's why it's so critical we keep the design on track and our environmental work on track associated with the intake. And associated with that, we also have an NEPA and CEQA requirement associated with jointly using that intake, and that also is on the critical path in order to achieve that cooperative agreement. But the last three really relate, the next three relate to funding. It's very, very important that each city establish the funding base for the project. And that really needs to be fully established no later than July of next year. And that then will allow us then to continue on into the design, build, operate contract. I've got to remind you that on the JPA, each city has to individually authorize expenditures for the design, build, operate before the Joint Powers Agency can authorize the issuance of that contract. So that's why it's very important that each city establish their funding sources. And then, again, the critical path is to award that contract in October of 2012. And we're well underway in meeting that schedule in terms of the technical activities associated with that. So the funding is all important. The planned activities for this next quarter should have it in your packet as well, is to start working on Plan B. And I don't want to really get into Plan B right now other than the fact that we still have to keep that alive, because we're never certain as to the funding for Plan A, which is the joint intake facility with RD 2035. Again, we've made the commitment, you've made the commitment for the environmental work, which is about $200,000 to go concurrent with our efforts on Plan A. We're deferring that as long as we can because we don't want to spend money unnecessarily. And we would start that work. Right now it's planned to start in July to do the environmental work. And the most you'll be at risk, will be at risk, is about $200,000 until July of next year, at which time we hope to know one way or another that there will be funding for RD 2035 for the joint intake. We want to establish and finalize the benchmark water treatment process. We highlight there, we're reviewing the SOQ for the design, build, operate teams. We'll establish the short list. We'll bring that to you in June. Jim Yost will talk more about where we stand on our work there. And also an item today is a draft fiscal year 2012 budget for your review. We won't ask you to approve that until either the May special meeting in May or a special meeting in June. But we obviously want you to take a look at it, ask questions, and any input you have. We're also continuing with regard to our funding activities. Oh, excuse me.
Yeah, can we ask a question?
Yes, yes, go ahead.
Sure. The cost of the environmental work for Plan B goes on, presumably, you said till maybe June of next year. Is there any prospect, though, that we might know about the funding for the Plan A intake before then? I mean,
We'll have a sense, but not really. One of the things that we're going to be doing in the next quarter is to continue our fund-seeking efforts, if that's the right way to phrase it, because it's really dependent on what's put into the federal budget to a large extent. How much money is put in the budget for fish screen through the ecosystem restoration program. So that will determine it. But because that's why I highlighted that the cooperative agreement is so important. We can't get right off on a cooperative agreement with Department of Fish and Game and Reclamation until we finish the 100% design of the intake. We're just doing the 30 right now, and we have the environmental documentation.
Chair Cravoza,
Wow.
or Chair Marble and Board Member Cravoza, during communications, I believe both Chair Marble and I will report on our activities over last week to that effect, and give you some of our impressions that we got from meeting from legislators concerning the actual construction dollar for the RD 2035 that may help you understand why we're in this dilemma point right now and how positive at least we came away with feelings.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just obviously looking for the soonest possible point that we can cease spending money on Plan B, and I understand the pickle we're in, but.
And that's why we deferred it as long as we can and try to minimize the effort as much as we can.
Yeah, it's a tough spot. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think we could say that funding appears assured for 11 and 12 for RD 2035. It's the construction phase of year 13, 14, and 15, which it has everybody a little bit on edge. So those are the years that we're hoping to firm up by July of next year.
Right, and
Thanks.
our intent, just to give you a perspective, we're deferring any engineering work, detailed design work until January 2013. So we're trying to minimize those higher cost items until that point.
Okay, great.
Chairman Marble?
Yes.
A question then. Some of the permits are relate to the intake, the environmental permits.
Yes.
We're working on those right now for Plan A. And if Plan B, we're not moving simultaneously forward with Plan B permits, is that correct?
That's correct. The only thing we will be doing would be starting in July is to have a supplemental EIS to indicate our intent
Okay.
to use the Plan B site.
So if we move to Plan B, we're keeping it as alive as we can now, but the permitting process would then have to...
Absolutely, we're focused on implementing Plan A. Yes. And speaking of permitting, that's a great segue into what we're doing. I just wanted to highlight this, and I'm not going to touch upon any of these. You can read all the details, but these are some of the permits that are so important to us, and I've not put them on our critical path, but they all add up to become our critical path. Some of these are all to be done in 2011, as are those. So we have 2 pages of permits that our program management team and environmental consultants are working diligently on, and we're in various stages of accomplishment on each of those. So you can see it's a big effort, a lot of agencies involved, and I'm sure we haven't even shown all of them on these 2 charts. But this is just 2011, and we have more than 2012 and 13 as we get into construction. And the critical path items associated with permitting, to give you a flavor for it, I've just highlighted on this next overhead. Again, CEQA, NEPA, documentation for the joint intake, work with PG&E. Real important is the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. That's a real key permit to keep us moving. And then, of course, site acquisition, particularly the water treatment plant site. So those are some of our key milestones, critical path items associated with the permitting activities. I've shown you this schedule in another fashion before. This is our schedule for the DBO implementation. Where right now we've revised the RFQ, which I mentioned at our last board meeting, and we received on April 15th statements of qualifications from all interested firms. And I'm going to turn this over now to Jim Yost. With his team has been putting a lot of work into developing the DBO concept, and we'll be evaluating the submittals that we've received.
Thank you, Eric. I can get started while she's getting us put together here. Just very pleased to announce that we did receive 5 statement of qualifications from 5 very qualified teams last Friday. So that's a major milestone. We're definitely moving forward in this procurement process. We'll be back to you, as you can see, in June with approval of what we come up with as a recommended shortlist, and we'll actually have a couple of the board members involved in some of that discussion. We will issue the draft RFP in July, and then you see a bunch of additional steps. There's actually a number of steps between the draft RFP and the final RFP that we don't show on there, but I won't bore you with that. But the folks who are here who will be submitting proposals will be interested to know we're still on schedule. We expect to issue the RFP, final RFP, in September. They will have until April of 2012 to prepare their proposals, and that's not a space of time where they work independently. We actually meet a couple of times during that period. We will have interviews with shortlisted DBO teams in May. Then we'll go through an extensive evaluation process and select a preferred team, make that recommendation to you. Then we will begin negotiations with that selected team, and we show it going on from June until November. If we're fortunate and we can arrive at a negotiated agreement more quickly, then it will accelerate things. But we're anticipating that you would award the contract in about November of 2012. And these are the teams that responded to the RFQ: CH2M Hill, CDM Constructors, Veolia Water, Aquacol JV, and Balfour Beatty. And you can see the major members of each of those teams. Very impressive list of folks. We have some of the best engineering firms in the country, some of the best operators, and some of the best constructors. So we're very excited about the participation we got. This is a very good showing. We, from the standpoint of the program management team now, we're heavily involved in preparation of the RFP, and that you'll see a significant cost in the budget for the first quarter of next year. That's to get that completed and out the door. So that's a primary task on our schedule right now.
Thanks, Jim.
Any questions for Jim from the board? Okay, thank you.
Just to wrap up this update, at the last board meeting, I was asked, or the staff was asked, to prepare a list of benefits, which you should have in your packet, a list of benefits associated both from federal, state, and local regional benefits associated with the program. This is really important for all of us as we communicate why we're doing the project and how important it is for a lot of different levels, people and agencies. I was also requested to see how we can be more cost-effective and collaborative. And I've also have a list put together after talking with staffs of both cities and the JPA, and that shows a list of collaboration for cost savings. And many of these, or most of them actually, are either ongoing or planned to be implemented. And the ongoing ones, for instance, include the compliance with the state and federal water quality regulations, discussions between the two cities, public outreach with regard to the water issues, where we have Kim Floyd's working for us on the joint powers, implementing the program, as well as we're trying to provide assistance to both cities, and the cities are sharing information as well. Coordination with Sierra Northern Railway. There's another collaborative activity ongoing, and we anticipate going ahead with the Urban Water Management Plan. That's very important. It's important for the agency that we have a plan, but in talking with the state, it looks like we can draw upon the individual plans of both cities so that we don't have to do our own plan. So that's very important in the coordination between the two cities. And on those collaboration, if there's anything you see in the next month or so that you'd like us to elaborate further upon, or other areas that we can work together, please let me know. And we can report back to you. And with that,
Chair Marble, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So in these areas, these joint activities kind of, I guess, take place at the initiative of our respective city managers, or, I mean, how, I mean, it's a great list, and I know it's probably fluid, but, yeah.
different forums, either through the work that we're doing collectively on the Joint Powers Agency, at our meetings, or individually that the cities have established either long ago or just are establishing communication on various items here.
Okay. So just like, for example, on the urban water management plan updates, we've both got one due at the end of June. So Greg and Bob, and you're kind of syncing with Jim on that, right? So some of the stuff that the JPA's got is flowing into our plans. I mean, I'm just...
Well, actually, the urban water management plan is an individual city submission, so we'll be submitting our own. It's working together to with the JPA to meet the requirements and form a working partnership on that plan.
I get it, but so that's you guys. I'm just kind of curious how the rubber's really hitting the road here. So that's you guys, tapping into, all of the CWA staff. I mean, we haven't set meetings to kind of coordinate what the common information is so that it's consistent in both reports.
Well, I'll comment a little bit on that, and I haven't had a chance to talk specifically with Eric about this, so some of the staff may be, but I mean, I view this as something moving into the future. We're going to continually have urban water management plan updates, and as the JPA, progresses, we will be coordinating. There may be some efficiencies to, funnel some stuff through a central point, so we aren't all hiring our own, help. I will say, I think our current urban water management plan for Davis due this June, we're certainly doing it on our own, but we are feeding off of some of the information we're learning about through the JPA efforts underway. But the current plan we're doing on our own, but we're trying to benefit from some of the information that's coming out of this agency. I think it's more forward-looking, not the current one due this month so much, or this year so much, is my take.
Yeah, that's correct. And I think some of the things that we can look forward to is perhaps some of our studies, instead of each of us doing an individual study, doing a study that encompasses all three agencies. And then we would break out our individual pieces that we're required to include into our update.
I think a good example of that is the water conservation effort that Davis has previously undertaken that Woodland is learning from as well as they implement their water conservation program. But it really helps us because we don't have to do it then with both cities, so there is that cost effectiveness that helps us minimize our cost in working with the state whereby both cities are doing it. So part of the program now is working with them to provide us an out, if you will, to rely on each city's urban water management plan.
Okay.
Yes, to highlight that a little bit, I think at our last meeting, or the meeting before, I don't remember which, Director Cravoza brought up the concept of increased efficiency in our utilization of both cities and not duplicating efforts. And I think that this could even be titled not just collaboration for cost savings, but efficiencies in general. Sometimes some of those efficiencies may cost the same, but they still represent a savings in other areas. So I just continue to encourage that. I think the board set that policy, and we certainly want to encourage it. I'd also like to suggest that in the non-JPA activity arena, you add the Sac Metro Chamber Water Flood Committee, which I know I talked to John Woodland. This is not the cap-to-cap water team that I'm referring to. It's the year-round policy setting group that's meeting on a monthly basis regionally to set general water policy that would go before the Sac Metro Chamber Board. And I know that John Woodling mentioned to me the other day that he was going to calendar you in for a presentation. Has he talked to you about that yet?
Yes, we talked about that, and I was going to be presenting last week when we were in Washington.
Okay.
But we're going to set up another date.
Good, because I certainly think we can take advantage. That's a water group that can maybe give some ideas that would be helpful.
Okay, I know a big topic where we're collaborating on is public outreach, and I know that's important as we move forward into the rates, establishing rates. So I'd like Kim just to update you what we have in store.
Good afternoon. Thanks for taking time to listen to me provide an update on public outreach this afternoon. First, I want to thank all of you for the active role and the steps you've taken to advance information about the project in the community. I think that the response that you have received has been excellent, and your work has really laid the groundwork for us to keep moving forward successfully. Since I last updated you, we've spent a lot of time on legislative relations and the communications in support of the effort to secure the 100% funding for the 30% design with our partnership with RD 2035, and then also on separate authorizations for appropriations for the water treatment facilities. So we are working on cap to cap, as well as individual efforts from both RD 2035 and the agency. We've also, in terms of media relations, thank you, Dr. Marble, for your recent opinion piece. We spent a bit of time on media relations surrounding the approval of the water right permits. And so we had several positive articles appear out of that. And outreach related to that, we did an e-news, and then also did some Speakers Bureau presentations over the last few months. Our next one isn't scheduled until September. A lot of the community groups take summer breaks. So I think by that time we'll be able to go back and touch base with those groups to whom we've already presented, and then give them an update on where we are and show some really significant progress. And then we started a Facebook page. Some of you are fans. If you're not yet a fan, I'd encourage you to join. We have enough people who like the page now that we have a dedicated URL. So we're going to continue to try to push that as a way to get people involved so that we're cutting down on the costs of paper outreach materials. Upcoming, we will be participating in Celebrate Davis on May 19th, I believe it is, and we're in the process of developing an event exhibit, which we had hoped to do in years past, but we finally are in a position where we feel we have enough information that will stay current so that we can develop some displays. And one of the things we'd like to do for that, I think it's really important that people connect faces with names. And we've featured all of your names on our website, on outreach materials, but we'd like to have a group picture, not only for the website, but for our event display. So we'd like to get something scheduled in the next 2 weeks to try to get a group picture, so I'll follow up with all of you on that. Very, very important stuff, I know, heavy.
We have a camera.
Suits and ties, huh?
Go for it.
Today would have been a good day. You all look very nice.
Chair Marble, I was thinking that she's going to have us participate in one of the participatory activities that get people to your booth with pictures of us, and people could throw stuff at it or something like that. But
we talked about that.
I like the picture better.
Yeah. We did contemplate having little cutouts saying, Bill says, save water.
I was thinking water balloons,
Yeah.
Bobbleheads.
Bobbleheads would be a great idea.
Dump tank.
Our next big event, we are also in the planning stages for 2 community meetings, one June 8th in Woodland and one June 9th here in Davis. And it's just an opportunity to touch base with the community about where we are in the project, in some cases introduce the project to community members, tie in some water conservation topics. That's a good time during the summer to be talking about that. And then also, if we're prepared to do so, talk a little bit about rate impacts. And to advertise that, we are going to do a agency-wide newsletter. So it will go to ratepayers in both cities. And it is more costly than what we've done to date in terms of producing outreach materials, but we think at least one time a year it's important to try to get something in mailboxes and then also drive traffic to the website and the Facebook pages.
Questions? Comments? I forgot to let you know that I will be giving a presentation to the last of the 3 Rotary clubs here in Woodland. I presented to 2 already, and it's May the 26th.
Okay.
That I'll be presenting to the Woodland Rotary Club. And I've also extended an invitation to the Lions Club to do a presentation there.
Okay, great.
Seriously, off of the joke of the water balloons, but I've been to many Celebrate Davis events in the last few years that they've had them, and the booths that have the most traffic are ones that have participation activities. Usually it's something like spin a wheel and you get something afterward. It's a guess a game or a beanbag toss, but anything that gets people to like, oh, what are they doing? That you want to participate and potentially get something for. The prize, I think, could be, bottles of Woodland water or bottles of Davis water.
No one would play, maybe.
But they don't know that.
I think we will be tagging onto the City of Davis's booth, so we will work with them to try to think of creative ways to engage attendees.
But I'm thinking of it as an educational
Right.
piece that gets people to come, but educate at the same time in some participatory fashion would be a really good thing.
We'll definitely look into that. If you have other ideas, please.
Don't really like the water balloons, but
Are we doing anything for the county fair?
Well, this would, I think we should, and I'm not sure if the city is, no. All right, well, we'll look into doing something, and this booth, the idea is this event exhibit would be easily used at any of those types of community festivals, so I'll look into that.
Yeah, maybe a quiz, and if you get 6 out of 10 or 7 out of 10, you get a low-for-low shower head, or maybe that's the kind of thing. That's the kind of thing that goes on. Anything that decorates a child is, highly sought after.
Nozzles are always popular. You're right.
I was thinking of something like a tube of fluoridated toothpaste.
Yeah, I was going
That's a little too in.
A broom. Good.
Forward hoe.
great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Eric, is that? That's it. Okay, thank you. Paul, you're on, I think, for the next couple of items.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. To your point, I think the next items at least have some degree of overlap, so I was going to just say a few words about the quarterly treasurer's report, which I think will serve as a lead-in to the discussion of the planned or proposed budget, and then segue into an update on the overall financing plan. So agenda item number 3 is the quarterly treasurer's report, which is provided to you consistent with the sort of requirements of our JPA agreement. It intends primarily to just report quarterly the status of revenues and expenditures and funds under the auspices of the JPA. I would start by again noting that the JPA at the beginning of the year adopted a budget totaling $6,469,000. The budget to be funded through contributions from each of the member agencies equal to the budget. Year to date, we have collected essentially quarterly contributions from the cities of Davis and Woodland, totaling $4.68 million year to date. And as you know, the budget originally contemplated a contribution from UC Davis, which we are not seeking and is not being made in part because of the agreements that the JPA has reached with UC Davis related to their contribution status. We do anticipate through the end of this year to collect the full amounts from Davis and Woodland, totaling just under $6.25 million. On the expenditure side, this last quarter, invoices were paid totaling $1,947,000, bringing our year-to-date paid expenditures to $2,867,000. And based on that, your staff report includes a statement of fund balance, which showed the fund balance as of March 31st, 2011, sitting at about $2.19 or $2.2 million. One of the handouts, one of the puzzles that we left for you when you arrived at your dais is an updated sheet specific to the revenue, expenditure, and fund balance statements. And I would just note that in terms of this display, the only additional information you have is a column that shows the projected revenue and expenditures through the remainder of the current fiscal year, which is also presented to you in the upcoming or subsequent budget item. So based on our anticipated receipts of $6,248,000 through the remainder of this year, the JPA team has estimated the expenditures for this year as of June 30 to include the remaining work to be done, as well as work that's already been done for which payments have yet to be made. Anyway, the total expenditures are estimated to be about $6.1 million, which is $360,000 under the budgeted level, which is a good thing. And it also reflects on your fund balance statement. We anticipate to end the year with essentially $144,000 surplus relative to our collected revenues, which would, if these assumptions hold and our projections hold, we would end this year with a positive fund balance in excess of $520,000 going into next fiscal year. And so I think the bottom line is the JPA's activities continue to be largely within budget, and we anticipate ending the year well within our budget and slightly under the revenues that we've collected. I would just note that within the budget there are a number of line items and categories of expenditures that were not contemplated at the beginning of the fiscal year, and so on a line item by line item basis, we have in some cases some significant variances, activities, for example, related to the DBO procurement, and additional work, also a lot of the work around the securing the water rights and summer water purchase. And I would just note that the JPA staff has done a commendable job of sort of administratively modifying budgets within the line item so that we stay within the overall budget, even if individual categories and line items have necessarily been very flexible. And I think as we move into the discussion of the budget, you'll find that we're endeavoring to refine the level of detail that we prepare the budget, and as we move forward with that discussion and ultimately when the JPA board adopts a budget for next year, we will endeavor to kind of expand the level of detail so that we'll have a better handle not just on the overall budget but also by category and individual line items. And that work I think will also be aided as we move into the the phase of the project that Eric just alluded to in his update, with a little better sense of the specific task activities, the scope of those activities, and the cost of those activities. So we'll continue to refine the accounting and reporting of the JP activities consistent with the level of activity that warrants that. So with that, that concludes essentially an informational item, and to be available for any questions and or segue into the budget where we may continue the discussion.
Questions? Director Doty?
Thank you. Thank you for the update. I'm very happy to see that we have a positive fund balance. I'm asking a crystal ball question here. Is it necessary? Is it possible for us to reduce the amounts of subsidies or contributions from the two cities, since we have a healthy fund balance, or do you anticipate that we're going to be needing this in the next year's budget?
Well, I think we're going to touch on that when we get into the budget discussion in terms of what the proposal might be for funding next year's activities. I think clearly the short answer is that that's an option. I think at the staff level, in consultation with the finance folks at the two cities, there's some benefit to creating some level of reserve in the overall budget, particularly given the volatility and the uncertainty still of some of the items. And So at this point, I would just say that we would anticipate continuing to collect contributions from the two cities equal to the expended effort, but only to a point. In other words, we have no intention potentially of growing a fund balance, without obviously balancing that against the funding contributions. $500,000 on an $8 million proposed budget for next year is not a significant, overly significant reserve, in our opinion.
But you are meeting with the finance people from both cities about this?
Yes. Yep. And I would also just note that because the contributions to fund the budget we'll be doing on a periodic basis, I think there will be time even throughout the fiscal year if for reasons dictate that, for instance, the last quarter payment, could be adjusted or deferred depending on how we're doing.
Okay. Thank you.
Bottom line is the cities have control over their funds.
Other questions? Yes.
Paul, I gather that, at least from the little snippet within the staff report about land acquisition and permit fees, that particular line item is primarily for the purpose of the legal documentation and descriptions that we must take care of, and not as much for actual easement and purchase or purchase? Because we have we purchased,
are you referring to the
purchased any easements at this point?
Councilmember Souza, just
Are you referring to the proposed budget, or are you referring to expenditures to date?
This is the proposed summary fiscal year 10-11 and anticipated, actually it is 10-11, then there's an anticipated higher cost for 11-12.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the 11-12 budget in the next agenda item.
But within this budget for 10-11, we have a budgeted $486,000.
That's for permitting and land acquisition.
So there has been some easement acquisition.
There's been work done on defining the needs for that in meetings with the various owners of various parcels. At this point in time, the land we've acquired is really associated with CPG thus far. I'm not aware of any other land, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, that we have officially acquired other than that land.
That's why I'm asking. I wasn't either, so.
Yeah, no, we would have brought that to your attention.
Okay.
Yeah, there hasn't been none.
So it is just legal documentation and services.
The work associated with preparing the materials necessary to do that and talking with the individuals.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Any other questions? I have one. I have just two quick questions. The increase in legal fees, which is about $89,000, it looks to me like above budget. Is that largely associated? I think I heard you mention that the Conway purchase, the water right purchase. So those are our attorney legal fees, or are those additional fees largely associated with the DDO process?
No, well, it's a number of items, but the larger part of it is, I think the budget was established in May of last year.
Before we knew we were...
Exactly.
Okay.
And so much of that additional cost that have been incurred is associated with the CPG, RD 2035, our water rights.
The acquisition. Okay, that's all I need there. And then the other question I have is we're way under budget on public outreach. And I'm just curious to know what we had anticipated doing that we didn't do in the realm of public outreach, knowing that that's such a critical part of what we are doing. So I'd just like to know if we've missed something or if we've gotten a heck of a bargain.
I want to say you got a heck of a bargain. I actually had money when I was previously contracting with Joe's Associates. I had money left in that budget, so I didn't start charging against this budget, which we adopted in...
I think it was May. It was before we got here.
Yeah, well, we adopted the budget, and then I didn't start charging against it until October or November.
Okay.
So we had some considerable, I won't say savings, because we were building against another budget. I also predicated the budget on doing 3 community mailings. So agency-wide mailings, which is a big expense, and we're only doing 1.
Okay.
So where we can save money, we will save money.
Okay.
And, yeah.
I just wanted to know, because that number stared out so much at me, and we all know that the board has given direction that this public outreach is just critical to what we're doing in both of our communities. So I want to make sure we're getting a bargain, but I also want to make sure we're doing the work that needs to be done.
Did that mailing go out already? Is that?
No, it won't go out until the third week of May.
Got it.
Great.
Okay.
We'll go out the third week of May, and it will just be an informational newsletter.
Oh, that's the newsletter. Got
That's the
it.
newsletter. But again, so the budget had been predicated on 3 of those. And the postage is involved in that.
Okay.
So are we going to see that before it goes to press? Are we good? Yeah.
Your picture's going to be on it, so you're the dartboard up there.
And you'll be able to see that.
It's a shady looking one.
And it will look very much like the materials we already have, the brochure and some of the other fact sheets, just so that we are consistent with what we're doing, so.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, Paul, you want to get into the proposed budget?
Yeah, I think Eric will set up this item, and I'll assist as necessary.
Kim. Yeah. Do it mouse there. Yeah. Imagine.
Keep dropping. Here. Okay, well, I'll lead off and Paul will finish up. This is the agenda item associated with our proposed, what's a draft, and since it's proposed fiscal year 2011-2012 budget. And what I wanted to highlight, again, let me back up on that. We're going to be bringing this back to you for final adoption either May 26th, if we have a special board meeting then, or June 30th. It has to be done before the start of the new fiscal year, of course. So it'd be either one of those two. So we wanted you to have time to take a look at it, and any comments that you have, we'd be more than happy to answer. The budget that's been prepared, again, represents costs that we will incur during the next fiscal year from July 1st to June 30th. It's the cost that we will actually incur, irrespective of when the contract was let. So that's what those represent. What I wanted to highlight, and why I have a separate overhead for this, you have a lot of material. And I apologize for that, because some of the material is duplicative, where because last year when the budget was set versus now, we've made some adjustments to the cost categories. And the categories that we've established are more indicative of the actual functions that are taking place to implement the project. And in trying to correlate and be consistent, we had some difficulty making sure we had the money in the right category. And that's why now we're updating, and thankfully we always say this draft. So we're making sure that we're comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges when we look at these various cost categories. So what you've been given is an update from what was mailed out to you. But having said that, I wanted to highlight really what's, to me, very important. The most important are the major categories. There's 8 major categories that we're engaged in terms of implementing the project. You can see those there: program management, engineering, DVO procurement, environmental and permitting, public outreach, legal activities, land acquisition permits, and agency administration. I think that covers basically all the major categories of an agency in implementing a project such as this. I've also added a contingency. And starting with the contingency, we've added 5% of the total cost. Because at this stage of the game, there's things that are changing, and you saw that last year, how things came up that weren't anticipated. And I think it's wise to have that 5% contingency. I think when you look at this also from a big picture, the important thing is to see that we're moving ahead, because the predominant costs are going from planning, preliminary engineering, into now actual implementation. and there's more money now in DBO procurement, for instance, because we've moved ahead. We're moving to the next phase of work. There's more money in getting permits because we're now in the hard work of finalizing getting all those permits. There's more money in legal, and that's a lot of that is associated with the DBO. One of the things about DBO that have been promoted as being advantageous is the risk is put on to the teams, and hence to do that, obviously we need appropriate legal representation, appropriate documentation in our bid documents, and we feel we need that, and that's what much of that cost represents in that outside legal. The general counsel legal, I want to make sure you understand that. Dick Shanahan is part of agency administration, so the general counsel activities are included in the agency administration. So anyway, that gives you an overview of what we're doing and what entails these major categories. We have a detailed spreadsheet that has a number of tasks under each of these major categories to support those numbers. I'd like to then go into what I think is important is when do these costs incur? When are we incurring the costs? When do they occur, I should say, not incur. But, so the next overhead represents when we will have these costs taking place. And we've broken it down into Woodland's costs and Davis's costs. The total cost, again, is about $8.1 million. But what we've shown here behind each of the major total costs for each agency are how the costs break down by quarter. And this is obviously important in asking for the draw from each city in funding the project. And you'll see what also has happened. Just as we had a shift from the planning, environmental, the preliminary design into the DBO in our budget, you're seeing this shift here also, where much of that upfront work is taking place in the first quarter. The first quarter is about $2.75 million for the overall agency. That will drop down to about $2 million for the second and third quarter, and then the fourth quarter is $1.3 million. And the reason for that is much of the permitting work, much of the upfront engineering work, much of the establishment of the contracts for the DBO team, the evaluation of the DBO team in terms of establishing the request for proposals for those teams, establishing the specifications and the legal documents will take place in the first quarter and into the second quarter of the fiscal year. What remains in the second half of the year basically is to interface with the DBO teams who are receiving their proposals anticipated in about April. So at that point in time, we will then get involved in reviewing those proposals. So the work will be dropping off after the first half of this coming fiscal year. And much of the work takes place in the front end. And that's important in terms of the funding activities. And so I'd like to ask Paul to continue our discussion.
Thank you, Eric. But before we leave this slide, a couple of things to note. So at least the preliminary proposal for next fiscal year for the JPA's budget, it was $8,190,000, as Eric had walked through. The Woodland's share of that is just under $4.4 million, and the Davis share would be $3.8 million. So the staff has also, I think, done an appropriate job of refining the proportionate share of cost between the member agencies, less based on a kind of macro long-term, but as we move into a period of more significant expenditures, ensuring that the budget and each city's share reflects proportionate as appropriate. And then I was very thankful to see the quarterly breakout, because up until this point, in order to both manage this on the city budget side as well as cash flow, we have been making and requesting essentially equal quarterly contributions from each agency. but when we have a situation going into next fiscal year with a significant front-loading of those costs, we'll need to adjust how we collect that and potentially even use, the fund balance to smooth, kind of manage the cash flow. But at this point, and we'll still finalize this, it's likely that going into next fiscal year, we may actually front-load some of the collections from the two cities. So instead of maybe a quarter, 25% each quarter, maybe we collect a third up front and then quarter, and then see where we're at near the end of the year, and we'll coordinate that. I would also be remiss if I didn't note that part of the thinking in bringing you the budget as part of today's meeting as a preliminary is that based on at least initial feedback from the board, we would then ensure that as the two cities move forward with their respective budgets, that we're appropriately synchronizing, if you will, what the two cities are building into their budgets and ultimately what the city councils will be looking and being asked to adopt relative to city budgets, so that we don't present to them a final completed budget. So that's also part of the reason to get some feedback today, and then any modifications can be reflected in the budgets that the two cities are obviously needing to contemplate. The last note I would make on this particular slide before we move on is the funding for both current year as well as next year's operations of the JPA are essentially covered within the existing rate structures that we have for each of the agencies and the existing measures that each city has already put in place in terms of covering what I call the bridge financing of the startup of the JPA up to the need to make the significant commitment of funds consistent with the award of a DBO contract. So my point is that the 11-12 budget perhaps has less an impact on the short-term rate setting process that both cities have, but these are essentially covered within the resources that the two cities already have established respectively.
Also, in your packet is a 10-year projection. I know the board would like to look ahead as to what's ahead for the agency in the two cities. And we've translated that table that's in your packet, the 10-year look ahead, into a graph. Two graphs, actually. One that breaks it down into actual major categories of expenses. And I'll let Paul continue on with his discussion.
Yeah, well, this chart essentially is a graphic representation of, I think, exhibits B and C that are in your packet, that essentially reflects the accelerated pace, if you will, of significant capital project expenditures, again, tied to the award of a DBO contract. I would note that this chart represents primarily the cash flow and effectively budgetary requirements of each of the JPA to move the project into that phase. However, what's still contemplated relative to funding the significant capital outlay is the financing plan that is currently under development, whereby either directly through issuance of revenue bonds or a financing package that includes most likely a combination of sources. The idea is that the financing package will fund the cash flow requirements of the JPA and our contractual obligations, but what the two cities and member agencies will be incurring is the smooth cost of servicing any debt, whether it's bonds or loans, over a period of time. So when you get to the next slide that shows the next slide shows the same multi-year cash flow allocated across the two agencies. We're not needing the two cities and their rates to support effectively, $60 million of funding, 13, 14, 14, 15. That would come through either debt issue or loans or outside funding sources, and what gets then built into the budgets will be the cost of servicing the debt. So I think primarily these charts highlight the significant component of the overall JPA project budget that will soon be allocated to the DBO activities right up until we go online with the project. And unfortunately, what the graph suggests is it really dwarfs any of the detail relative to the other line items. But essentially, on an ongoing basis, what we're looking at is, once we get through the capital program, roughly $9 million a year in ongoing operating costs having to do with the operations and maintenance of the water project and water treatment plant and distribution. Also, costs have been reflected in here regarding supplemental water purchases. And Eric, you can help me. This would reflect, obviously, both the summer water that we've already secured and any estimates of any supplemental water that would be needed above that, but that would be part of your operating budget. And then the cities are going to overlay on top of this essentially the debt service and financing of that, and I'm going to discuss that in a little bit more detail when we get into the project financing piece. So,
okay. Well, thanks, Paul. Are there any questions on the budget or the draft?
Yes. Yeah, carry on, Director Soto.
Eric, I appreciate the materials that have been presented this afternoon on both schedule and budget, and it occurs to me that it would be, I think it would be helpful to the board if there was a cash-loaded schedule so that they could see what components were anticipated to be activities would be conducted in each year that result in this display. So I assume that you've used such a thing to build these documents, and it is I've found it in the past to be very helpful to have one single display that shows the schedule and the budgeted items that make up the cash flow in a single location.
Okay, no, we have it, the detail to build it up to this presentation, this summary presentation. But we do have that. If the board would like, we could obviously send that out in a...
Well, I'll let the board decide, but it seems to me to be, it would be a useful tool for them.
Other questions or comments?
I would concur with that statement, particularly when you look at 13, 14, 14, 15, 15, 16, where you have those three huge expenditure years. It'd be nice to know what $118 million is buying and $105 million and $44 million. It would be good to see that broken out so that when asked, we have a little more definitive answers to folks that are coming at us with the questions and the rate increases that both cities are going to have to incur. It's unfortunate that we couldn't spread that cost out over a substantially longer period of time to smooth those rates even further, but that cash flow is needed at that point in time, and I suspect that the contractors won't take an IOU for years to be paid later.
If I could ask a question just to clarify, I would again note that the staff report, I guess it's Exhibit A, has, although it's grossly summarized, a fair amount of detail related to the 11-12 budget. The chart that we were just looking at is basically a graphic representation of Exhibit C, which has the annual cash flow expectations for admin, the capital project, which is the design construction of the facilities, as well as the water purchase and the O&M. I guess the question I would ask to Board Member Saylor's question was whether or not the level of detail that you see in Exhibit A, if that was projected out for the 10-year period, if that provides that level, and maybe there needs to be some narrative and footnotes with it to show what are the major items within the category.
I think that looking at A and C, the item Exhibit C has just 4 expenditure categories, where A has additional ones. I think as you start looking at items in 13, 14, and 14, 15 under capital project with $112 million in one year and $100 million in the next, it might be, I think it would be useful to see what
the components of that capital project are that are anticipated to be constructed during those 2 years. I think it'd be useful because there may well be a time when some planning changes and an item or two slip or advance, and it would be useful for the board to have something they could refer back to and to tell the public and to just explain to themselves what changed. And
we can provide you that additional detail, and then once you receive that, if there's more information you'd like, we could do that as well.
Is that okay with the board?
Yes.
I see nods, so.
And if I could just add one more to Board Member Souza's question in terms of, managing the rate impacts by managing the cash flow. At a very basic level, the financing plan is actually intended to smooth out, if you will, the impacts both to the two cities and essentially to the ratepayers. So this is really a representation, as I understand it, of the obligations of the agency through the project, and then the financing obviously would smooth it. I think the staff has also been aggressively looking at other ways within the moving the project forward to look at the timing and the structure of these commitments, so that I think there's both a cash flow component of the non-financed piece as well as the piece that would need to be financed. So I would just stress that we're looking at all possible ways to mitigate to the maximum extent possible the impact on rates, but at the same time keep the project moving forward on schedule. And unfortunately, based on even some earlier discussion, we're also retaining some flexibility in the budget, as some pretty significant decisions and policy decisions are still yet ahead of us that will inform how ultimately the project moves forward.
Director Doty?
Thank you. Actually, Paul hit on my question, or one of my concerns is that when you look at this, both the 10-year cash flow and the one showing the contributions from the cities, it's fairly startling. And it looks like the cities each have to come up with $60 million in 2013, 2014, and we know that's not the case. But a member of the public seeing this might think that's the case. And so I'd like to see some sort of a note or arrow or something, financing incurred, and then show. You clarify it totally when you say that the cost is going to be about $9 million a year and it's going to be relatively flat out till 20-something. Show where the financing occurs, and then show what the actual expenditure is going to be, that it's not going to be $120 million in 1 year. Or it is, but we're spreading that cost out, just like buying a car.
All right. Yes.
And in the out years, when we're just in the operation phase, we have a agency administration / contingency of about $1 million a year to operate. I was just wondering what the assumptions are about what the structure is of the JPA of the Clean Water Agency. Is it a half-time manager and a secretary and legal counsel? Or what do you have is there any thinking about that yet, about what might be the ongoing needs in staffing?
There is just some preliminary thinking. And as a minimum, it would be the staff you have right now, but it would be augmented. And I'd see a full-time person who's really managing the technical activities as well as the general manager managing the administrative end of the business. And it's a matter of how we structure the requirements for the DBO and the oversight provided either directly by the JPA and or how each city contributes people to help manage those activities, because there is a distinct interface with the delivery of water through those regional facilities to each of the distribution systems at the city.
So I know it's a long way out, and the numbers are small relative to the early years, but at some point I think the agency would have to get involved in that discussion and get ourselves set up for the right.
You're absolutely right.
Right tasks at that time.
And that would be something I think in the next 3 months we could add to that to-do list, actually.
Good point. All right. Any other direction from the council besides that's been given? All right. We'll look forward to seeing it again. Paul, are you going to take on the financing piece now?
Thank you. So I think a good segue would be here. This is essentially an oral update on the current status of the efforts underway to develop the comprehensive financing plan, not only in support of the cash flow requirements of the agency, but also critical to informing the two member agencies, or at least the two cities, in terms of their long-range planning and rate-setting exercise. Again, I would note that the two main components that are going to drive the ultimate financing plan are both the overall funding requirements for the project and, as we just touched on, the timing of those, and also factoring into that as it relates to the two cities' rate-setting process, the lead time that's required in order for the any public agency to modify or adjust utility rates required to support not just the funding commitments, but in this case also the issuance of any debt or financing package that we would need to do that. You will note from the presentation we gave to the board, I think it was October of last year, that we've been making preparations and working towards a financing plan. Our sort of a fire was lit under all of our seats, in part when the decision was made to move to a design, build, operate delivery method, because that also has the effect of advancing through the obligation of a DBO contract significant commitments of funds, if not expenditure of funds. So we've really been sort of ratcheting up the efforts on the financing plan. I will again note that we think we're in pretty good shape relative to the funding requirements of the JPA's activities through, I think, as your slide showed, November of 2012, which is when the commitments are planned to be made for the design, build, and operate contract, and that in the short term those requirements are, we think, fairly well covered, or very well covered within our existing rate and our existing capacities within the two cities. The city of Woodland did a multi-year rate increase, I think in the last year or so, both tied to the Woodlands project around metering of their customers, but also with an eye towards the requirements of this project. The city of Davis established rates last year that would fund the line of credit that we have issued and secured to provide the Davis's share of those contributions, and the budget and the cash flow projections that you just saw are consistent with and within the capacities of those short-term financing. As we move into the long-range plan, again, the design-build contract looms as the main funding requirement that we need to, and I would say that initially there's two issues here. One is the how we're contemplating the two cities working together to come up with the funding, and also working independently and collaboratively with the necessary linkage to the city's budgets and rate setting process. Up until this point, I would say that the rate setting and the financing plan almost by necessity has assumed a largely revenue bond funded financing plan that would be backed entirely by the rates that the two cities and any other member agencies would be able to bring to that. And in the last several months, we've again revised our plan and work plan to reflect the accelerated need and timing for that. However, we do anticipate ultimately that the financing plan for a project of this magnitude, particularly in this arena, would likely include, as I said earlier, a package of financing. And basically, we are looking at any and all funding and financing options that are available, again with the goal of reducing the overall cost of the project and managing the rate impacts. So in addition to sort of the vanilla revenue bond financing, JPA staff and staff from the two cities continue to pursue a number of other funding sources, and I'll just list a few in particular. There's an opportunity, or at least the potential, that some Proposition 84 funds might still be available in support of a project such as this. The State Revolving Loan Fund could be a very attractive source, at least I would say from a cost of capital. I think they're in the kind of 3% interest rate. That is very attractive relative to the bond alternative. One of the main issues that we are looking at with the State Revolving Loan Fund is that typically their standard template requires a fairly abbreviated amortization schedule, so say over 20-year periods. So while the cost may be attractive, we're looking at what a 20-year and how the amortization schedule for any debt impacts the rates. To the project and ratepayers' benefit, it appears as though that there is some opportunity for flexibility should we be successful in securing state revolving loan funds to negotiate, and the longer we could stretch out the repayment of a state revolving loan, it starts to have very significant positive impact to us as it relates to our rates. My understanding is that we have at this point at least proceeded with putting a funding request for this project in line for. There's a number of steps that you have to go through to secure state revolving loans, so we are absolutely keeping that sort of in play as we move through the process with the hopes of actually being successful. Another funding source that we're actively looking at, although it's a little bit more challenging, is funds that might be available through the State Infrastructure Bank, or iBank, which is another financing. And we just need to make sure that the requirements that come along with any of these funding sources don't negatively compromise or impact any of the other financing components. And as a couple of board members alluded to, we continue to hope that there may be some support through federal funding for this project. I think the focus in the short term has been, and I think you'll hear a little bit more about it, in terms of the absolute need to secure the federal funding for the partnership with the joint intake structure, which will have a huge impact, because absent that funding, should the project need to pursue an alternative intake structure, there are additional costs associated with doing that. So it's clearly within the project's interest to ensure that the funding is there for the joint intake structure. And I think there's some hope that if we're successful in that arena, that at least the path has been laid to potentially seek additional funding support, hopefully in support of this project. So again, we're looking at all of those impacts. Having said that, as we move forward with the planning and as we move forward specifically with the two cities long-range financial plan and rate modeling, we are continuing to use what I hope to be some conservative assumptions about how the financing would come to pass, such that we would have the ability to move forward with the project and have the community support for the rates that are needed, even absent a lot of favorable financing. So what we're looking at is, and I don't want to call it a worst-case scenario, but a fairly conservative, or let's call it a level of confidence that we're setting rates that we need to deliver the project, even if we have to rely more heavily on bond financing, with the hope that going forward we can manage the costs and deliver a financing plan that could actually significantly reduce the need to go to the maximum rates that a long-range plan would necessitate. Also, it's very important to note that in addition to the budget and cash flow requirements of the project that you've seen, which include largely the regional facilities as well as the facilities that benefit the two-member agencies separately but are still under the purview of the JPA, both the City of Davis, the City of Woodland, and I assume to some extent as well the university, have some fairly significant capital investments in our local facility needs that need to be implemented in concert with moving forward this project. In our last estimates, and these are being revised. For instance, Davis will have another between $30 and $35 million of local capital infrastructure on just the city side. I think Woodland's also perhaps in the $40-45 million range, and I note that because it, as we develop the financing plan and the rate modeling, we're making sure that we're including not just the JPA's specific requirements, but really everything that it's going to take for the member agencies to deliver the high-quality, reliable water to our residents. At this point, we are, the question has come up before, and it continues to come up as to when we get to the issuing of bonds, has there been a decision yet on whether those will be issued by the member agencies or whether it might be advantageous for them to be issued by the JPA? That is still an open question. We're still looking at that. I will again say that our default plan is for each city to look at the best way to finance their respective components. And so there are some pretty good reasons why at this point we're contemplating each city taking on the debt issue that they need to do. And again, that has to do with ensuring that their local needs are met. There may be some different requirements or different abilities to structure debt depending on what the overall rate impacts and budgetary pressures are. Although, as we've said all along, if there's opportunities to save some funds through doing a joint issue, we're looking at sharing and saving costs, absolutely. There is also the possibility that at the end of the day it might make sense for the JPA to be the issuing authority, and so we have not precluded that possibility, and we'll certainly keep the board apprised as we move forward on that. In our most recent discussions, though, I would note that to the extent that we aggressively pursue some state funding, either revolving loan fund or others, it is very possible that those funding requests might be better served coming through the JPA as the regional water agency, with obviously the support and the funding support of the two cities, as opposed to one city or another city or the two cities. So one of the criteria, as you know, on some of these very competitive funding sources, to the extent to which it meets critical needs that have regional impacts, and clearly we're going to take advantage of the JPA's ability to give us the best chance of securing those funds. And then from a financing structure, rate setting standpoint, there's also potentially some advantages of any loans that the JPA can secure, and then the loan repayments are in the JPA budget really as operating expenditures. It really can have a significant positive impact in the city's ability to manage our overall debt ratios, and bond rating. So I think we're likely to move forward with a kind of a more of a packaged approach, and the JPA is going to have a critical role in helping, I think, secure those funds going forward. I think the last comment I would make would just have to do with the timing, and I think it's important to note, at least from I think not only Davis but Woodland's perspective, when we were here in October, and as we were preparing for this, I was going to remind the board that the two cities were originally contemplating doing one additional annual rate increase, albeit starting the rate ramp up that we needed to do, particularly in Davis. Woodland already has a multi-year rate, but we were gearing probably 12 or 18 months from now the need to do the refined work in support of a multi-year rate increase to get us where we need to go. The Davis staff discussed recommended rate increases to the Davis City Council earlier this spring, and based on our sort of projection of where the rates will need to go and what we were contemplating in terms of a multi-year rate, a year from now we've received direction, at least in Davis, to hold off on doing the one-year annual rate increase, and are now working on actually accelerating bringing back to the City Council the actual multi-year rate increase within the next couple of months, so that this current upcoming Prop 218 process could hopefully serve to get the City of Davis to where it will need to be ultimately with the rates. And so the current plan, at least on Davis' side, and I'll touch a little bit on Woodland, is that we're necessarily delaying our rate implementation of rates for 11-12. We'll be back later this spring and summer. We're now looking at a fall 2018 process for the full rate ramp up that's needed, with likely having the rates in effect by December, January, as opposed to, again, doing one more year and then coming back a year from now. So that's, I think it could be very helpful, because we'll have a better sense of our ability to support that earlier than otherwise, and it's also necessitated us doing some additional refinements of the budgets and the rate projections in support of that exercise. I think the City of Woodland, while they're not necessarily on the same time frame relative to an urgency on the multi-year rate, again, the decision to move to a design, build, operate and accelerating of the cash flow will likely require the City of Woodland to accelerate by potentially a full year the need to do the multi-year rate. And that also, I think, provides an opportunity, as was just touched on, as it relates to some of the public outreach, to try to ensure we're on as parallel path, as possible. The work needed to develop the multi-year rates, but also the public outreach that's necessitated not only to educate the community, but also required legally to get through the rate setting process. In conclusion, I would again note that the JPA staff and the two cities have sort of formalized their financing team to include the finance staff from both cities, the fiscal advisors, JPA staff, myself, and we're meeting on a fairly regular basis to be refining and bringing this forward. And I suspect that from this point going forward, you're likely to be receiving update on the overall financing plan and progress on it as part of your regular quarterly meetings, either with the Treasurer's report or separately, as opposed to on an ad hoc basis, which you've been receiving up till now. So with that, be happy to answer any questions on.
Want a two-sentence summary?
We're working our tails off to develop the best comprehensive plan that we can, with really a focus on making sure that we're in concert with the two cities and the rate setting and budgetary process that needs to be. And while we're necessarily taking a fairly conservative approach to the rate setting and the rate modeling because of all of the open questions, I think there's a significant opportunity, if we're successful through financing and project management, to, as we go forward, keep the rates, manage the rates so that they're significantly below the maximum rates that we may be requesting the councils and the communities to support.
Good, thank you. Vice Chair Souza.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair Marble. Paul, you talked about the path that we may go in issuance of bonds, whether together or separate. And I know in the scheme of things, the document and legal fees will be small compared to the actual loans themselves. But that is a cost that would have to be borne by both entity. It would be interesting to know what those costs are, rather than having two bond counsels, one bond counsel, rather than two sets of document fees, one set of document fees. That's a number that we would need to know. That's a savings that could be achieved by doing so. And likewise, I'd be interested in knowing what kind of interest rates could be secured through higher amounts of bonding capacity versus half amounts of bonding capacity, whether, in essence, are we going to pay more for bonding more money or less for bonding less money?
Just a quick comment. I mean, these are significant bond issues, even individually, and I'm not sure that there's a very significant interest rate impact. Actually, what will impact the interest rate is the bond rating that each agency and or the JPA can assign to them. But as you said, the cost of issuance, whether it's financing help, bond counsel, underwriter costs. They are a component to it. And we are looking, actually, even if the two cities develop their own unique bond deal, the idea of doing one bond issue with, say, a Series A and a Series B that support the two is clearly something that we're looking at specifically for the managing the cost of issuance.
And then sort of an adjunct question would be, typically when public entities do big utility projects, they go to the bond market. But is there not a potential another market, and I'm speaking of mutual fund market, where holders of large amounts of money, PERS being one of them, other entities across the ocean holding mutual funds, other entities that may have capacity to lend these large amounts of money, knowing that they're going to be guaranteed a cash flow for a 30-year period that may give us a better deal?
Yeah, so again, I said we're looking at everything, and I want to emphasize that, whether it's we put that in the category of third-party financing / private financing. I will tell you that both through the JPA and through the cities, we are being contacted on a regular basis from folks and interests that may have that. Right. I would just say, and this is maybe an anecdotal thing, and I hope I don't go back on this, I think any potential advantage we see from pursuing those perhaps has less to do with the interest rates, because typically cities are able to get fairly competitive rates on the bond market. But if through an outside funding source we can develop a component of the financing that maybe has a 40-year or longer time frame, then even a small additional cost may be beneficial if we're able to spread it out over. So we're really looking at those for some ways to structure the debt favorably, as opposed to competing with tax-exempt municipal bonds, which are generally fairly favorable.
Great, thank you.
Director Cravosa?
Yeah, I think Paul just answered my question as part of Stephen's, which is just that we are giving some thought to stretching the financing out longer than 30 years and the pros and cons of doing that. And remind me, on the summer water purchase, did the payments go on for what, 24 years, or is that right? And when you talk about financing here, is that piece, that 78 million or whatever it was cost, is that being lumped in with this financing round, or we're keeping that all separate?
Well, I think in the projections you see those as an annual cash flow component. I think if, given the long-term commitment of that, if there's an ability for the JPA or its member agencies to sort of refinance, if you will, that obligation to favorably, we will continue. In fact, as you recall, we built into the water agreements the ability to do that. It's a consideration, but we're not looking at, Plan A of the financing specifically to refinance the water purchase.
But I mean, will it make sense as we go down this road of financing the big stuff to just make sure we're keeping an eye on
absolutely
moving that into it? Yeah, great. Thanks.
Very good. I don't see any other questions. So thank you. Water supply needs and alternatives. Eric, is this yours?
Just a quick overview. This topic was really spurred by developing the budget, and it was spurred by the fact that how much money do we put in investigating the various options available for supplemental water supply in the summer. We all know we need more than what we got from CPG, especially during real severe drought periods. And so we need to define what we need to plan for, and we need to define where do we put our money on the front end, and what do we study? Do we put it, and how much do we put into negotiating with upstream senior water rights holders? How much do we put into ASR? How much do we put into working with Yolo County? There's a vast array of options available, and we didn't want to spend money unnecessarily this coming year on something that might not be the best way to go to meet our supplemental water needs. So our program manager, Wes Jost, has started a study and well into a study in terms of assessing the various options available to us and the ramifications and the viability of each of those in the future, and what are our needs in the future. And these are going to be distinct decisions the board's going to be faced with, is how much do we plan for. The occurrence in 100 years, the occurrence in 50 years of severe drought, those are decisions, and we're looking at the ramifications. So hopefully you'll be in a better position to make those decisions. And I'd like to ask Jim to update you on their work right now.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Let's get started. I know we're running out of time here, so I don't want to take any longer than we have to, but if you can click the first slide, Chris. As Eric has already said today, you have achieved a real goal, and that's getting 2 new surface water supplies on board. I want to point out to you both of these have conditions, and also I'll define some of those conditions to you, and I want to also point out that the regulatory process is continuing on both of these. So we don't have a water right nailed down at this point, and we don't have an agreement with Conaway that provides us a water right nailed down at this point either. There's continuing processing through the State Water Resources Board, Control Board. We will have, at the end of the process from Conaway, a water right and an agreement with the Bureau of Reclamation. And that process is going to take 2 years, maybe? 2.5 years. So we're partway there, but we aren't completely there. So just want to make that clear. Chris? The cities have been working diligently over the last several months to define their groundwater pumping targets. They're tied to the wastewater discharge limit compliance. They're tied to compliance with the drinking water standards. And very importantly, they're tied to user satisfaction. So they want to make sure when folks spend all this money, they're happy with the water supply they get. And that relates directly to how much groundwater is pumped to meet the demands in the summer months. So we started a supplemental supply analysis, and we're partway through this process, and I'll describe that to you now. The objectives of this process are to establish the needs beyond those provided by the Sacramento River Water Right Permit and the Conaway Preservation Group water purchase and the groundwater supplies. And to allocate these supplies among the 2 cities and to UC Davis. Chris? So, how did we go through kind of trying to evaluate this? Well, we established this hierarchy of how we would use the water. We've got a complex spreadsheet that has logic in it, and it uses this priority to figure out where the demands will first be met. So before I start into that, let me just say on this pyramid on the left-hand side, you'll see water conservation. All the demands we're using in this process have been updated to the current projections of per capita demands. Those are substantially less than they were 2-3 years ago. So we have integrated a very aggressive water conservation component. On the right-hand side, during real dry years, we expect to implement a demand management component. Now, what Chris has done is put together this detailed model that starts allocating supply to meet the demands, and we preferentially use the water right permit as the first source of supply. Then we go to the Conaway purchase water, and then finally we go to the municipal groundwater. We are on top of this pyramid evaluating supplemental supply options. I expect once we begin to see how those will be integrated and what makes sense, those will be used preferentially to the municipal groundwater. So the hierarchy is going to be to use as much surface water or other supplies as we possibly can before we start pumping groundwater. Is that clear to everyone? So let's take a look at the surface water. First, we have the water right permit. As you know, gives us 45,000 acre-feet annual maximum diversion entitlement, a diversion rate of 80 CFS on a maximum monthly average basis. Very, very importantly, this diversion is prohibited when Term 91 is in effect, and I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about that. And as part of one of the conditions of the water right permit, we have to prepare and submit to the board for their approval a supplemental water supply plan. So let's look at Term 91. As I said, the diversions are subject to Term 91 curtailments, and this occurs in most years. As you'll see in a minute, there are very few years when we don't have those curtailments. The Term 91 record is rather short. They didn't start actual definition of Term 91 constraints until 1984. So, you know, that's only about 25 years. That is not a long enough period to make the kind of decisions you need to make spending the money you're spending. So we had this dilemma. How can we give you advice on that short of a record? And the other major factor is Term 91 curtailment criteria are changing over time, and we anticipate that will become more restrictive in the future. So what we did was worked with MBK, the fellow that testified with me at the water right hearing, to develop a longer Term 91 record, and we used synthesized hydrologic conditions in the Sacramento River watershed to do that. And this is the result. And there are some important things to see here. So we went from having a 25-year record to now we have over nearly a 90-year record, 81 years. But very importantly, notice there are only these little short periods of time when Term 91 did not go into effect out of that whole 92-year period, 82-year period. Another very important thing, for the most part, a majority of the months that Term 91 is imposed is about 3 months. So that's a real important fact when we're analyzing options to fill these voids. We had extreme periods, 3 of them over that period of time when we got up to as high as 7 months. That's a pretty severe situation to deal with, but that only occurs about 4% of the time. And some of the real problem areas are going to be the years where we have consecutive years that exceed 3 months. So just for your understanding, that gives you some idea of the complexity of trying to analyze these, this supply and when it will be available. Now let's, and this summarizes that same information in a little different format. Let me just point out that about 2/3 of the time we will have Term 91 conditions that will be imposed for 3 months or less. About 90% of the time, 4 months or less. So this period right out here occurs, let's say, just on average once in 10 years, and the real severe conditions only occur once in 25 years. So again, when you're trying to plan a water supply, you want to spend your money to provide you the most bang for the buck, and in the years that are way out there and occur once in 25 years, you want to use the least expensive thing you can do to solve the problem, because you don't want to spend a lot of money on something that hardly ever happens. Now let's look at the Conaway water right purchase. The beautiful thing about this, and obviously why we wanted to buy water from them, is you can divert during Term 91 conditions. However, the Conaway water is limited to diversions in the period from April to October, and it's limited to 10,000 acre-feet per year, with another restriction of 7,500 acre-feet during the critical summer months of July through September. It also has a condition that can reduce the yield from that water right during what's called Shasta critical years by 25%. So that means in those Shasta critical years, the supply available annually would be 7,500 acre-feet, and unfortunately it also reduces the amount available in the critical summer months, and that would be down to 5,625. So here's what it looks like. These SCs show you the time over that 82-year period when Shasta conditions imposed that 25% restraint. And you see that it's not really tied very directly to the term 91 conditions in the Sacramento River. And you'd say, well, how can that possibly be? This is inflow that comes into Lake Shasta, and it's not uncommon to have snowfall in Lake Shasta, a Lake Shasta watershed that's very different than the whole of the Sacramento River watershed. So you can have conditions, as you see right here, where we had snowfall in the Shasta watershed that was low in comparison to the Sacramento River, and we had conditions at Shasta dictating a 25% reduction. When you get up into these periods, when you have a drought that's severe, it's pretty much statewide and would impact both. Okay, now let's look at the third supply, which is the Woodland-Davis groundwater. In Woodland, groundwater usage is limited from a drinking water standpoint by the nitrate levels, and from the wastewater discharge standpoint, pumping, at least preliminarily, I want to stress that some of these numbers are preliminary and may change, but right now we're using 30%. So to comply with the waste discharge requirements, Woodland cannot divert more than 30% of its supply using groundwater, or the wastewater discharge limits would be violated. Davis groundwater pumping can exceed 16 million gallons a day. That's the capacity of their deep wells. And both cities are constrained by hardness and TDS really as a user satisfaction criteria. You have systems that, well, you might have an isolated user out there who's fairly close to a well. In the summertime, if you fire a well up and they happen to be close to the well, they could get primarily groundwater, and of course you don't want that to happen. So we are working with the cities. They're doing their own internal analysis to try and figure out how to modify their system and how to manage their system so that does not occur. And then, you know, every time we turn around, we have a new requirement coming on the scene. In this case, it happens to be hexavalent chromium. The standard is being set as we speak. If that is set anywhere near as severe as we're afraid it might, that's going to have a real significant impact on the ability of both cities to pump their groundwater. So let me quickly go through the analysis that we're partway through. You saw that we synthesized the hydrologic record. We have integrated the Davis and Woodland demand projections into this model. From that, we are able to determine the magnitude and frequency of supply deficits, and this is about where we are in the process right now. We will then look at supplemental supply options and how they might help solve the problem. We'll work with the two cities to define supply reliability criteria. So what do you do in a really severe drought? How much cutback do you impose on your users? And then we'll try and balance the supply reliability and risk for each of these options with the cost, and out of that should come some solutions on how to put a program together that best meets the needs. Now we get into what you'll probably find pretty interesting. We'll show you some results. So Chris is going to use the Excel model that he's developed, and it has variable parameters up here that you can change to get whatever answer you want to see. So you're going to see quite a few of these charts, so let me just explain them to you quickly. Up here are the colors that you see in the chart. So the deficits, when they occur, will be red, groundwater is yellow, CPG water is green, our water right water is blue, and the volume of water produced through the water treatment plant in a month is shown in black, and that's these lines, and they vary because of the number of days in the month. So here we have a situation where we have year 2016, first year of operation of the project. We have term 91 in effect. This would occur about 38% of the time on average, and we're going to impose some demand reductions later, so we tell you that there is no reduction in this one. So then this tells you how much water right water we use, how much Conaway water we use, what the deficit is, and what the percent of groundwater, the maximum month percentage use of groundwater in comparison to the total demand. So in this case, we've used all the Conaway water. We have used most of the water available in the critical months, but some of it outside those months. We have no deficit, and the groundwater use is about 13% of the total. The groundwater supply is about 13% of the total demand, probably in this month. So that's 2016. Now let's look at the same conditions in 2040. You lost me, Chris. Okay. Pretty much the same situation. So the good news here, this occurs, as I told you a little earlier, about 2/3 of the time. 2/3 of the time we can meet the water demands with the with the water purchase and the water right that we have. So that's very good news. And you can see that what does happen, though, as the demands increase, the amount of groundwater we have to pump in the summer months increases to 28%. No. Now let's look at a little more severe situation. This is the situation where we have term 91 lasting 7 months. We have a severe drought, so we have the Shasta reduction in place, and we get less yield out of the Conaway water, and you begin to see the problems. The red indicates periods of time when we have a deficit, and this shows you in yellow that we're pumping an awful lot of groundwater. 2/3 of the water in some of those months is groundwater. That's not acceptable. So we're going to have to blend in these solutions, these supplemental supply solutions, to try and reduce that. Yeah, this, as Chris points out, this occurs 4% of the time, so this is once every 25 years. Very rare occurrence. This is about the worst case scenario, yeah. Now let's look at that same situation in 2040. Obviously it's a little worse because the demands have increased. So the deficits have increased, and you can see out in this month, even pumping all the groundwater that we could pump in the 2 cities, we still have a deficit. So those, the red and the yellow areas are the areas we're concentrating on to try and figure out how to get supplemental supply to meet the needs during those critical months.
Jim?
So what are we?
Jim?
What we're looking at now is demand management. So, Chris, if you could go back to that chart. So we're looking at demand management. This means either imposing demand restrictions or asking folks to reduce their demands, but it's a way to reduce the demands on the system. We're working with the cities to define what would trigger those reductions and how much the reduction would be. Obviously, this is a low-cost alternative. It has a rather limited impact, though, on groundwater pumping, and it doesn't solve the issue of water quality in the distribution system and client satisfaction, public acceptance. And in fact, it'll be most effective when used with other supply alternatives. But let us just show you a case where we've imposed a 10% demand reduction, and it's hard to remember what the previous chart looked like, but you have in fact reduced the red area and the yellow area. So it has improved the situation. Now let's just keep going because we're pushing. The next thing I want to show you is the impact ASR wells would have. And let me tell you that Woodland is in fact installing an ASR well right now. So that's a great boon to this project, because we will be able to use that well to do hydraulic testing, and we'll analyze the cuttings that come out of the drilling of that well to be able to do geochemical modeling. And so we'll be able to make much better estimates of how much water we could put in the ground and then how much we could pull out and what the quality is likely going to be. This is not a silver bullet, though, because we'll need a permit. We'll have to amend our water right to allow storage. Right now, the water right doesn't allow storage. And we'll have to do a supplemental EIR. We will go through an analysis of the comparative reliability of this option. You know very well, if you put the water in the ground and you have it under your city, it's going to be very reliable. In the driest year, you've got the water sitting there. So hopefully, we can make this work. This would allow us to reduce groundwater pumping. It would improve user satisfaction, and we just need to define now the capital operational costs and see if it works out to be one of the more financially feasible options. So Chris will show you what that would look like. Maybe. There it is. So the idea is during these months...
Jim, can you just define ASR just in case anybody hears?
ASR is an aquifer storage and recovery well. So what we're doing is treating surface water, running it through a pipeline to a well, injecting it in the ground, and then when we need to use it, pumping it back out of the ground. Great time to do that is when we have excess capacity in the water treatment plant, which is in the wintertime, and that also happens to be the time when we have water available in the Sacramento River to divert. So it's a perfect combination. So here are the months in this condition, which is that worst case in 2040 where we had 7 months of Term 91 restriction. We could, and again, let me just emphasize, we do not have these numbers nailed down yet, but the potential is there to create storage in the ground that exceeds the amount of deficits in that year. And that's just considered on a one-year basis. So I don't expect we're going to be able to put all of the water we think we'll be able to put into the ground and extract it, but we're going to get a large part of that. So it looks very encouraging. It looks like we could satisfy a significant part of the demand, even in the driest conditions, using ASR wells.
How do you overcome, even if you use that water, you still have groundwater usage that could be in excess of the percentage you had previously indicated
That's a
so how do you deal with that at that point,
Bill? And what we will do is not just inject that year. We'll inject over a number of years, and we won't use all this water we put in
over multiple years.
We expect to try and bank some water so that when we get into this kind of a year, we could also use it to satisfy this area in yellow. Chris?
Excuse me, Bill. One thing to notice on that is that if we do bank that, where we're showing that we're pumping groundwater, that groundwater will be of a higher quality than our groundwater right now, and that will improve our ability to meet our discharge requirements.
And we'll be able to tell you, hopefully, in about 3 months, what our first cut at, what the quality of that water will be.
Jim, I'm sorry.
Is it how hard is it to amend the water right to allow storage? Is that a? I mean, we have the water right. We don't want to. We don't want to get it
that would
up.
not. It would be an effort. It would require a supplemental EIR. The more significant regulatory hurdle, though, would be at the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board, which regulates discharges to land. A lot of agencies want to do this, but here in the Central Valley, our Central Valley Board is very concerned about groundwater quality impacts with ASR. And the State Water Resources Control Board currently is coordinating with the Central Valley Regional Board to try to come up with some statewide standards for how to do this and what are going to be the regulatory quality. But it's more the bigger concern is not the water right and the ability to store the water from a water right perspective, but rather the state's and the Central Valley's regional board's concerns about water quality impacts associated with ASR wells. And that's an ongoing dialogue right now at the state level.
We have had one preliminary meeting with those folks, and compared to where they were 2-3 years ago, it's like night and day. They're much more receptive now. They said that to get a permit to run the pilot plant, which we'll want to do in the city of Woodland in the first few years, is a matter of them writing a letter to us. That's what they anticipate. And that once we decide we want to go forward with the ASR well, they expect in 3 or 4 months that we'd be able to get a permit. We'll see if that holds true, but at least that's what they said, and that's a 180-degree shift in what they were doing prior to that.
Jim, some of the water quality issues, nitrates and hexavalent chromium and things, you're storing in a different level so that doesn't become an issue, or is that still an issue, or is it something that gets diluted over time? Or is that what you're working on now?
Yeah, and you know, I won't be able to stand up here and answer that question conclusively for you until we get surface water into the city of Woodland and they inject it in the ground and then we extract it. But we'll give you preliminary estimates, and we'll draw on experience that a number of folks who have implemented these programs around the state of California already have. And so we'll make some educated guesses at that.
Jim, maybe it would be helpful for me if you could go back to that the last visual that showed the aquifer storage recovery component. Yeah. So if we're able to pull this off, we're banking water in the wet months when we have it available in the winter. In this critical year, the yellow already represents sort of maximum groundwater pumping for Woodland and Davis.
Yeah, it's actually probably exceeding.
Increase pumping capacity out of the ground to get the additional ASR water out?
Yes.
So there would potentially be additional local well capacity improvements to accomplish this as part of this,
correct.
Right?
Yeah. Not absolutely correct, Bob, because might be able to convert some of the existing wells that we don't need to use in the future into ASR wells, but likely it means drilling new wells that are specifically designed to be ASR wells.
Right. I just wanted to point that out, and especially for the Davis board members, because we've been talking about relying solely on our deep wells. If we're able to do this, we may need more than just our existing deep wells to pump this much water out of the ground. But
that's right.
When we were looking at the construction budgets before, and what was in there for the cost for supplemental water, were you?
We had costs in there to potentially drill one ASR well in addition to the one Woodland's putting in right now, or spend that money, that equivalent amount of money, on other options.
On other water rights.
And as you recall, when we've done this long-term cash flow projection for you, we put in $3 million from day one. We put in $3 million a year for supplemental water supply purchase. We've spent $2.6 million of that on the Conaway purchase. So we have about $400,000 a year to stay within the budget to comply with kind of what we told you early on. That's not a lot of money, but that might be enough to implement an ASR program.
Jim, just to keep going on Bob's questions a little bit. So the yellow band there, which is the combined Woodland-Davis groundwater, Bob, are we saying for Davis that yellow band means the 6 Davis deep aquifer wells are operating, or more than the 6 Davis deep wells are operating?
It is based on the 6 wells in Davis operating.
Okay.
I showed you the criteria for Davis early on. Whatever the pumping capacity was that I showed you, I don't remember the number at the moment.
16 MGD.
It's 11,000.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's your 6 wells.
And we get the 16 MGD from those 6 wells. That's right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just let me ask you quickly, but it's not
an acceptable situation. So I don't want to imply that we'd be happy if we just got rid of the red on here. We want to get rid of the red on here and take this yellow down to about half of the size that it is now.
Yeah. All right. Okay.
We're pumping 2/3 of the water, 2/3 of the demand in some of those summer months is coming from groundwater. That won't work.
Jim, the distinction you're making there, just in case it's not clear with everyone, is getting rid of the red means we can provide water to our community, but either for aesthetic reasons or potentially wastewater discharge reasons, we may have problems, even if through ASR and groundwater and CPG water we can meet the quantity demand, the quality may pose issues.
That's correct, yeah.
I think it's also worth noting that what we're moving towards here is representing that in the worst-case scenario, we may have to look at other sources of water other than what we have directly available on this chart.
And you'll note, we do not have any demand reduction in this portrayal of the situation, so I know you'd want to impose at least a 10% reduction and maybe more. So that would also improve.
Jim, you're not looking at any conservation measures. You're looking at existing usage at this point in time by each household in the cities.
No, I think you've included.
We have built in a significant amount of water conservation and projection of the demand.
Within this demand?
That's correct.
Okay.
Back to, yeah. The last thing that we're going to be looking at, the last option, is to buy additional water. And whether this means working with an upstream water rights holder on the Sacramento River, a Yolo County Flood Control and Water Conservation District, or some other option, the idea is get more surface water. So we're looking at confirming potential sellers out there and what their likely acquisition option will look like. What will likely happen, you can imagine somebody trying to sell us water to meet the needs that I've shown you here. They aren't going to know from one year to the next how much we want. So we're going to have to pay them probably some kind of an option payment to reserve that water, so when we need it, we have access to it. So we'll look at the cost for that initial option payment and the ongoing costs to actually purchase the water. We'll look at the reliability, how flexible that option might be in meeting our demands. And one of the nice things about this is the more surface water you get, the more user satisfaction you get. So this is one that would make people very happy, except for the cost. So here's our schedule. Let's close real quickly. We're defining the deficits. We'll have that done probably in about May. We'll be analyzing these options and should have the first cut at that done in July. We'll confirm the supply strategy, probably be back to you to tell you what the results are and make some recommendations in September. And then next year, we'll begin trying to implement some of these options.
Yes. Director Saylor.
Jim, in the discussions of ASR and the other options that you're looking at, I assume that includes consideration of partnerships with the Yolo Flood Control and Irrigation District and some of the mechanisms for linking the plumbing of their operation with this project?
That's absolutely correct. Yes, it does.
Good.
Are you also including an option to pump groundwater out of Woodland, for example, and allow Conway Ranch to use that groundwater in exchange for some of their surface water?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
Although I have to tell you, when I raised this issue with them the other night, they said, please don't lay anything more on us right now. We are busily trying to get all of our other work done, but we need to get input from them on whether that will work, because we need some answers within the next 2 or 3 months.
All right. Any other questions?
Sorry for having to go through this so fast.
Thank you very much. We're to item 7, I think, and Eric, you need some direction to negotiate and approve pipeline easements on non-Conway areas mostly.
Right, and I'd like to have Dick present this issue.
Good afternoon, board members. This matter relates to some of the nuts and bolts details on acquisition of land and rights-of-way. And when you look at this project, I visualize land and rights-of-way in sort of 4 pieces. Piece 1 are the pieces we're acquiring through Conway Preservation Group, which were the contracts you approved in December. Piece 2 would be the pipeline easements, the remaining pipeline easements you need from other private property owners, both raw water transmission lines as well as treated water lines. The third piece would be the portions of the pipeline that are going to be within county roads, and the final piece is the water treatment plant site. This agenda item just relates to those first two items. With respect to the Conway portions, we entered into the contracts in December, but those contracts involve detailed real property transactions, preparation of easement documents, and escrow. And this document, the proposed resolution, would authorize the general manager to essentially do the paperwork to accept those easements and go through the escrow process pursuant to the contract you approved in December. The second big piece of it has to do with these other private property owners. There's 13 of them that we will need to acquire easements from, and through West Yost Associates, we have retained a right-of-way consultant to contact those property owners and seek to negotiate acquisitions and to do the appraisals and make the offers and, hopefully reach amicable purchase of easements among those 13 landowners. This resolution would authorize your general manager, in consultation with Bender Rosenthal, to negotiate easement acquisitions with those 13 property owners, subject to a not to exceed limit of $100,000 per parcel, and subject to the budget limitations. And with that, it's getting late, so I won't spend a ton of time on this, but staff recommends approval of the resolution and stand available if you have any questions.
I'd just like to add that this is not going to be done in a vacuum, that we'd be sharing all the information with, obviously, the Technical Advisory Committee and members of each city's staff. So, and one of the reasons for doing it is to expedite it. We don't want to call a special meeting every time that we have to execute an agreement.
Good. I think we've all had a chance to study it, and I think one of us, I'll make a motion that we grant you those authorities as stated in item 7.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Now, I have one question before we begin item 8. This CEQA addendum is pretty long. Is there anybody here from the public that desires to speak on item 8? Okay. I don't know how much of a presentation we require on this. I know we've all studied it, sat up late at night to read through it. And
I think your concerns are well-founded. I would have the same, and I apologize for getting it to you so late. This was something that has been developed and was felt to be very important to be associated with our water rights process in terms of securing it. And it was felt that this was important enough to get it moving now, and that's why we stuck it in at the last minute. But I apologize for that, because I understand how much you have to read. I'd like Dick perhaps to explain.
Let me ask a question. When does this need to be approved to not cause us to undergo any issues? Okay.
There's not a clear answer to that. It does not need to be approved this evening. It's staff's recommendation and preference that it be approved this evening. It relates to the petitions to implement the CPG water right purchase that have been filed with the State Water Resources Control Board. Those petitions have been filed. State Water Board staff is processing those applications. There are, as outlined in the staff report and the CEQA addendum, a few minor CEQA issues that State Board staff might identify, and it's our desire through this addendum to sort of close the loop on those issues. And the risk of delay is that the State Board staff on its own may start to evaluate these issues, which may not be desirable.
And then second question, do the cities the cities originally gave CEQA approval to our original environmental impact report. Do the cities have to weigh in on this addendum?
No, they don't. Another thing the proposed resolution would accomplish would be to memorialize the fact that Woodland Davis Clean Water Agency has assumed the CEQA lead agency role with your creation in 2009.
Okay. So let me just get the sense from the board. I know we haven't given you time to give us much of a presentation, but the board feel like you're prepared to act on this item today? Okay.
Chair Marble, I did not get through the 103 pages. I got about halfway through it, got to some of the graphs, and a lot of it is graphs, and didn't spend the time on the graphs towards the end. I don't know how in depth I must understand the graphs that were doing the hydrological studies on the river, but I must say I was remiss in fulfilling my duty of reading all those graphs.
Well, I wasn't trying to call you out on that, but I'm prepared to act on it. I just want to make sure that this whole board is comfortable with going forward, given the short amount of time you've had to look at it.
Well, if I'm understanding it, the key conclusion is that our water permit doesn't have any effect.
Yeah, I'm comfortable.
I'm happy with my knowledge that I obtained.
Okay. Well, to me, it's just like a cleanup document, and I'm very comfortable having read through it in its entirety, moving ahead.
What a braggart.
I'm not.
He's good.
I don't know. It wasn't enjoyable reading. I'm much more enjoying reading the biography of George Washington than I've been reading. So.
I was reading while watching Giants game.
I'd make a motion, unless I'm happy if the board wants additional discussion on it. If not, I'd make a motion to accept this EIR addendum.
I'll second.
Any discussion on that? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. And then we'll find our place on the next agenda item. Item 9, selection of chair and vice chair of the board. Richard, is that your?
Yes, there's a brief staff report in the record, in the agenda packet rather. The joint powers agreement provides that the chair position will rotate on an annual basis on the fiscal year unless the board decides otherwise, and it also provides that the chair will alternate between City of Davis and City of Woodland. The current chair is a City of Woodland representative, so when the board elects a new chair, the chair should be a City of Davis representative, and conversely, the new vice chair should be a City of Davis, excuse me, thank you, City of Woodland representative. The last June or end of the fiscal year, we didn't do this because it was kind of a partial year up and running, so Mr. Marbles had the privilege of a year and a half of service, but now this will get us on an annual cycle of changing the chair and vice chair.
Thank you. I'll make a motion for Vice Chair Souza to serve as the incoming chair of the agency.
I'll second.
I'd just ask Marty if I could have the second.
Oh, I'm sorry. Of course.
It's okay.
They have to do that way at the Woodland City Council meetings, or they just run right over you.
Very good. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries unanimously.
Chair Mark, yes, you're still Chair Mark.
I must say it's been a privilege to serve under you for the last year and a half. You have been a model that I hope to emulate. You've been marvelous in all the conducting of the meetings and in representing this agency, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Here, here.
Thank you.
We will still have one more meeting, or no? We're not going to meet till, because
We still have one or two.
Yeah, we've got, yeah.
There's a number of actions that have to be taken before the end of this fiscal year.
Right.
And so
So we got May 26th
a
and
special meeting either or and possibly both, May 26th and June 30th. So if you could get both on your calendar, we'd really appreciate it. We still have to adopt the budget. We have to approve a number of contracts that expire by the end of this fiscal year, by June 30th, so we need to, renew some of those contracts as well.
So you still have a lot of time, Chair Marble.
do we need a motion on the vice chair, though, for next year? And I think that should come from Woodland. I mean, I think, can we ask Woodland to nominate their vice chair for Woodland? I mean, I'd be delighted to do it, but unless Director Doty would like to step forward, I think I'd love to nominate Bill Marble to step back into the vice chair, or step into the vice chair slot, but I don't know if that's where we are on that. So
I'll serve wherever the board wants me to serve. I'll second that. No, should Woodman second that nomination?
You could, yes, if you want.
Okay, I'll second the nomination for Bill.
okay.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right, we'll stay at it.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Musical chairs.
This has really been a good experience, I think, for
And
all
just
of
to
us.
confirm, I think the prior discussion recognized that, but these new appointments take effect July 1.
That means that we'll just switch hats on July 1.
Yep.
Exactly. Okay, Technical Advisory Committee comments?
This affects more sort of the local side, but I think that it'll speak to more cooperation between the two city staffs as we move forward. Davis staff gave our city council a little overview of our entire water supply system and operations, and we touched on the surface water project and the local improvements that would be part of that. We're in the midst of finalizing our own distribution system optimization plan, which is basically what's going to define our local improvements. Out of that, we have been getting contacted about our local improvements. There's a lot of interest in the private world about the design and construction of those things. There have been some very interesting ideas put forth by some of the interested parties, some of our local and regional professionals. And these are issues I'll be talking to Greg about to see if there are any synergies on our local improvements as both of our communities pursue that, to see if there's some savings in that regard too. I'd also just note that I've been asked to come speak to the Sacramento area professional group of architects and consulting engineers in May. While the focus isn't this project in and of itself, it's certainly going to be something I'll touch on.
We'll weave it in.
Yes, I will. Though I will speak, I've been invited as a Davis representative, so I'll be focusing a little bit on some of what Davis is up to, but I'll certainly be giving that audience an update on where we are in the JPA.
Great. Thank you. Anything else?
There's nothing
Greg,
else.
you've been too busy with a sinkhole to have time to do anything else.
Pull a bunch of cars out?
No.
Very good. Board member comments? Sid? Marty?
First of all, this has been an incredibly productive and interesting meeting. It's wonderful to see all of the details of this implementation strategy laid out, and I'm looking forward to watching it continue to unfold. A couple of comments. Bill, there are 3 Rotary clubs in Davis that you haven't been to yet. So I'll work with you to...
I'll work the slides for Jeff.
All right, we need to get you over there. I want to introduce to all of you Joseph Lawler, Joe, would you raise your hand? So Joe is a UC Davis student in the Community and Regional Development Department. He's a senior. He's working with my office in an internship this quarter and hopefully through the summer as well. And Joe's assignment is to work with the fluoridation committee of the Health Council that is interested in having an item come before each of the city councils in the next couple of months so that we can anticipate the July 2011 RFP language that the JPA may be putting forward, so that we try to do that have that consideration by the councils in a timely way. So Joe may be in contact with any of you, and I hope that you give him an easy ear and access to your mountains of information and knowledge. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
All I was going to mention is there's a well over a 50% chance I'll be out of country on May 26th, so we can factor that in. We should keep in touch.
Okay. Thank you. Chair-to-be Souza?
I'll just speak briefly, and you can fill in some of the gaps that I may not touch on, but we had a very productive meeting a week ago in Washington, D.C. Executive Director, General Manager Eric Mishi, Chair Marble, myself, representatives of RD 2035, met with multiple representatives, first thanking them for helping us secure the beginning of the funds for the design of the facility, but seeking to garner the rest of the $50 million worth of construction funds that will be necessary from the Bureau of Reclamation to complete the new intake facility portion of which is for the urban or for the agricultural use. And also, within those discussions with offices of Senator Boxer, Feinstein, Representatives Thompson, McClintock, Herger, Matsui, offices of Budget and Management and Reclamation, we weaved in and very tactfully mention of our portion, the not only the intake facility, but the treatment facility, and that $350 million that we're going to need as two cities, and started to get on their radar the necessity to try and find some budgetary help for us along the lines not only within the reclamation portion, at least from the intake facility portion, but from the treatment facility portion, where we could find necessary resources to offset some of those costs to our ratepayers. And so we've planted that seed, I think very successfully, to do follow-up as we go along, as Chair Marble and General Manager Mishi go on the cap-to-cap trip, to continue pushing that, because it is the number one, as Bill said many times, the number one regional project that we will be pushing on the cap-to-cap trip. And it is, since it is the regional project, it should seek and should be the recipient of funds from the federal government. So I think it was, all in all, a two-day blitzkrieg that we were able to conduct as rain was falling on us. Most of those 2 days, jumping from cab to cab as we were going from office to office. It was pretty jam-packed. It was rather exciting to do it, and we are planning to go back and continue this dialogue that we started with those offices and those representatives who we met in person, many, and representatives of their office in September, to continue this dialogue so that we are not letting up on the pedal to get as many federal dollars as we can towards this project.
Yeah, I won't reiterate that. I'll just make the comment that we are one of the top priorities regionally, water-wise, and I saw the final documents actually today for cap-to-cap, and together with the Regional Sanitation District and us and the project related to Folsom, we are the priority page on Metro Chamber water team. So that's good, and we need to continue to do everything we can, especially by way of attendance at what will be the follow-up to cap, which is the ongoing monthly water flood committee meeting that takes place at the Metro Chamber, and I would hope that perhaps Stephen or other members of this board can make it a point to attend that meeting. They've been very productive, I think, in terms of our being viewed as regional partners, and not just people with a handout, but partners in advancing the water needs of the region. I'd also like to let you know that subsequent to our visit, in fact, on Monday of this week, the representative from Senator Feinstein's office was on the ranch. So that visit was very productive in not only painting the picture of this facility, but also in getting appropriate people out to make sure that make sure that the process that's going through the Bureau of Reclamation remains funded. It was not entirely clear to me, maybe to all of you, but certainly not to me, where the source of the funding for the intake structure for Reclamation District 2035 is coming from. I kind of in my own mind had thought it was a general fund kind of item with part of the budget. It is not. It's part of a separate fund. Water attorneys may understand this, but the restoration fund is a separate fund that is funded by utilities and by users, by water users, and that fund can only be used for things like the intake structure associated with RD 2035. So our mission is to ensure that that restoration fund remains intact, and 2 weeks ago it was not intact. So the fact that it was put back into the budget may not have happened 2 weeks ago, and I think we need to make sure that continues. I thought the visits were incredibly productive. It is actually fun it's fun to be part of this board, but it was incredibly enjoyable to be part of a team associated with Reclamation District 2035 and the landowner, the majority landowner in the Conaway Ranch, in pursuing something together. And I think it's a great example of that partnership. So I felt the trip was worthwhile, and that's all I'll say about it. Any other comments? If not, yes.
I would just ask, I know the Metro Chamber often, for each of its working groups, puts together these pretty beautiful brochures that then are presented at Cap to Cap. And, if Eric and Lynn Ann could, get at least 10 copies or something of those and get them into our Davis CMO office. I'd love to share those with my colleagues and around that, our project is really very prominent within the Cap to Cap trip. I think it's great for everybody to see the outreach that's going on. So, and the effort to bring in supplemental funding. So, great.
Yeah.
The follow-up meetings that you refer to, Bill, and if it's helpful for Sid and me to be present, just let me know, and I'm speaking for Sid as well.
I think it is. But this is the way that this committee met for the first time in, I believe it was December or January, first time in history. And the stated purpose of the committee was to make sure that, number one, that Cap to Cap doesn't just end with some visits in offices whenever Cap to Cap is over, which traditionally in the water field, Cap to Cap happens and then we don't start meeting again until October, November the following year. And a Metro Chamber wanted a way to prioritize regional water concerns year-round and to have appropriate follow-up year-round. So I think to have the county there would be outstanding. Certainly to have the water agency represented is appropriate. If UCD, you guys are taxed beyond limits, I know, and time-wise, but it is the forum that was set there to establish those priorities and follow-up mechanisms. How well that happens, I don't know yet. That's still in infancy, but I think that it would be appropriate. They certainly appreciate what the people that are there from Yolo County. It's kind of been a first for them to have that kind of participation from Yolo County, not just in our concerns, but in the entire regional concerns. So to me, it's kind of like a mini SACOG associated with water.
I'd like to add one comment. We had a follow-up meeting with CPG and with RD 2035 this week in anticipation of our plans for the future. And one of the items, as we've talked about before, is another follow-up meeting after Cap to Cap, and this would be in September. And it has been mentioned, and that's really a prelude to them adopting their fiscal year 2011-2012 budget, and to make sure that the act is accounted for that provides funding for the fish screens. But one of the discussion points there was how effective the letter was that we put together pretty much at the last minute which had signatures from a wide variety of organizations, including environmental groups, the UC Davis, every member here, the Yolo County, which we appreciated the effort to get those. But what we talked about was making it even more extensive. There's a lot of other agencies and environmental groups that would be supportive of this, and we're going to make an effort to get all of them, and that's going to look very impressive to the elected officials in Washington. And to that end, what we're going to ask is each city, particularly each city and others, appropriate agencies, including the county, is if we could get on their agendas, on your various agendas, and to accomplish a resolution authorizing the mayor to sign at any point in time support for us, it would help us go through that whole process. And so that would give us, I hate to use the word blank check, but it would give us an opportunity, rather than scrambling and each city and county have their own due process. If we had that resolution, we wouldn't be subject to potential delays or possibilities of not getting the signatures. So I want to alert you that we're going to be proposing that and coming to each of you with that.
I would also have the, you touched on the environmental groups, but we had the chamber from Woodland, but we didn't have the chamber from Davis. So I think it's incumbent upon us to reach out to the business leaders in the city of Davis, because they go through a little more extensive process in order to support anything, to get them on board. Because it was, being the representative from Davis, I felt it was absent. We had environmental representation, but not business representation.
Very good. Any opposition to adjourning the meeting?
Yeah.
Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay.